So I was sitting here thinking about bouillon, which, you get these little condensed cubes of salt and some flavoring. And these things are quite useful for a multitude of purposes. But one obvious thing you use it for is as an ingredient to a recipe. So you might have a full meal and it calls for one or two of these cubes, and you throw them in with your stew or whatever you're making. And that's nice. But you can actually just dunk one of these things in a hot cup of water and make, well, it's not really broth, but it's a salty little pseudo soup. And I guess some people like that, but far fewer people than would enjoy the full stew or whatever you're making with the bouillon, a full recipe. Still fewer people might actually just use the cube directly. You might think that that's a little weird, and it is. But it turns out if you're fasting, you're not eating for an extended period of time, you can consume salt to, it's an electrolyte. A lot of people say that they don't feel as terrible when they're fasting if they eat a little salt from time to time. And so this has salt and flavor, and it's essentially calorie free. So you might just consume a bit of that. But because it's so concentrated and it's a lot of salt, you would probably just break off a little piece of it. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it turns out that this is a really nice analogy for how to transmit truth to other people. We are told to be like the salt. Priests in ancient times, one of their jobs was to prepare the animal sacrifices. So the people would bring the animal, and it would be the best, whatever it was, from their flock or herd or whatever, depending on the kind of animal it was. It couldn't have blemishes. It had to be the firstborn, etc., etc. So there was this notion of it being the best they had. And they'd bring it to the priest, and the priest would prepare it, and part of that preparation was salting it. So after the animal was killed and skinned, the priest would put salt on it, and in that way make the sacrifice better than what the person could provide on their own. And there's important symbolism there. So salt is an important thing, but it turns out that it's really strong, and most people don't see it as having value in and of itself. They see the value as what it brings out in the foods it's applied to. But some weirdos like salt on its own, and those people, they have it in abundance. So the materials that I've prepared, they're very dense. And some people would say that I'm very dense and that but the materials are very dense. And it's intentionally that way. Mostly just because there's so much to convey that if it were put into long form, it would take far too much time, and it would be too long for any of you to be able to read. But it's quite important that you be able to take that and distribute it in ways that are more palatable for other people. And so I have The Glory of God as Intelligence pulled up here as a PDF. I'm just going to jump to a random part of this and show you an example of how you can do this. So I didn't prep this. I have no idea where we're going. So I'm just going to scroll randomly. Let's go right here and click this page, okay? Now, these sections, I think, are a little longer than I typically write these days, but I try to keep chapters under 20 pages, and I try to keep these sections to less than 2 pages, which, that is about that. Okay, so this is a conclusion section, And I'm just going to scroll up to before that because we could do that, but I think the point wouldn't be as plainly illustrated. So I have not looked at this in a very long time, this book. So I'm just going to speed read this very quickly here on the spot. All right, this is a good one. Of course, I would say that, right? No, but for illustrating the point, okay? So this is just one section. It's a little more than 1 page total. And yet, there are so many ideas in this one section. And so what we could do here, if we wanted an exercise, we could say, grab the information that's in this section and present it in your own words. And it's unlikely that that is going to be as short as this section. So that might, if let's say I wanted to do this in writing, maybe I would have a 10-page document at the conclusion of me trying to teach those ideas in my own words, right? But another thing you could do is just pick out one idea and do that. And maybe you want to do that in text. Maybe you could make a video. So if you wanted to do that, you could read through one of these paragraphs, and there are 4 paragraphs in this section, and zoom in on a specific idea. So let me just jump to this paragraph here randomly, and I'll read it, and then we can walk through that. And then I'm going to show you at least one other technique that you could use that's even easier than that. So this says, anyone claiming experiences with God ought to be able to instruct others on how to obtain those same experiences. If they are unable to bring others who apply their ideas to the same experiences they claim, you can set them down as impostors. Their experiences either never happened, came from the devil, or happened long ago, and they have since lost that light and replaced it with darkness through sin. Well, those are very important ideas. They're extremely relevant today. They're going to continue to be relevant tomorrow. So, going through this, if you were to read this and you were saying, well, how would I put this into my own words? You could do that. And one tactic that you can use is that you can ask yourself what scriptures support these ideas. So there's nuance there, because maybe you disagree with something that's said and you have reasons for that. That's great. The point is, take what's good in your view and use it to do more good. And then you can change it however you need to align with your sincere belief of what's true. So, how could you support this idea that anyone who claims experiences with God ought to be able to instruct others in the same, and that the success or failure of a person who implemented those instructions would be indicative of whether that messenger was true or not, or what they were saying, at least, what the message was true or not? What scriptures might support this? Well, you could pull up any of the scriptures that talk about how God lives according to laws of cause and effect. You could pull up John 7:17, where Jesus proposes this idea of using evidence to test spiritual claims, right? There are actually a bunch of scriptures in the New Testament where Jesus talks about he links doing what the Father says and efficacy. So without me, you could do nothing. There are a bunch of scriptures and a bunch of ways you could take this. But the point is, just because the sentence doesn't have a footnote or scripture doesn't mean that there aren't scriptures to back up the ideas. In fact, this is another space-saving and time-saving technique, but it's possible to quote scripture to support pretty much every sentence in every book that I write. So that can be useful. All right, so another way you could do this is you could take this principle and apply it to a specific situation and actually focus your teaching on that situation. And so you're dominating it with an application rather than the principle. So this is another salt versus broth versus stew situation. Because if it's not obvious, not everybody can work or think at the principle level. And different people do so at different levels of efficacy. And so if you wanted to teach this principle, you might pick out, say, a religious teacher who's teaching things, who claims to have had these profound experiences, but whose followers don't. And you could teach that applied principle to people who maybe would not read this on a page and be able to apply it to the situation they're in. Okay, so now that I've shown you that, I want to show you another technique, which is if you cruise through and find a passage of scripture quoted, either in the text or as a footnote, you could usually take that and expound upon it, and it's almost like a canned Sunday school lesson. Again, for brevity's sake, I very rarely spend a lot of time expounding on scripture in the books. That's not because it's not a useful thing to do. It just, I have to presuppose that people have the firepower to do that themselves, because if I walk through every passage verse by verse, the books would be 10 times longer than they are, and I'm already at the limit. It's just like these videos. I only publish one every other day because more than that's just too much for people. And faced with an impossible goal, they'll do nothing rather than a little, right? So every other day is the most that people are willing to tolerate. That's their window of receipt. And it's the same with quoting the scriptures in the books. Now, that being said, I quote tons of scriptures in the books that I write, but I don't have the time to go through them line by line and just expound on their application to the principles that I'm using them to illustrate or support. So here's a passage from Alma 32. You've probably read it 5 billion times, but could you use this to show the importance of evaluating the message independent of the messenger, which is the title of this section? You've probably never taught it that way. You've probably never heard it taught that way. And so if you were to read through this section and then reread this passage, it might illuminate to you an exposition of this passage that is very different than what you've heard before, or at least highlights something new and useful that maybe you haven't quite noticed before. So in this case, what I'm using it for is to demonstrate how you would go about testing a new putative truth. So this is an idea that you're hearing for the first time. You're not sure yet if it's actually true or not. And so when we read Alma 32, typically this is used to convince people to accept the gospel writ large, right? Well, just consider that it might be true and walk through that. And where does it go? Are there fruits that are positive? Does it result in positive change? Well, that is rarely applied at the specific level of ideas. You almost never hear that, right? Because people that quote this passage typically see the gospel as a box. And if the box is true, everything in it is good and everything outside of it is bad. Of course, that's not true. And so we never get away from the need to evaluate ideas. And that includes ideas we've already accepted as true, because knowledge is progressive. It keeps getting better. And that causes us to need to reinterpret things that we already found to be true to see if there's a higher resolution we could see it in a division of, oh, here's the good part and this part not so much. And I saw this as one thing before, but now I'm seeing it as two things. So you can use Alma 32 to illustrate the need to evaluate specific ideas. And it's the same principle no matter how you teach it. But again, what you're helping people do is break it down to a level that they wouldn't apply it without your help. You know, we can zoom out and just talk about the scriptures as a whole. There's a reason just handing someone a copy of the scriptures and saying, this is your instruction book, go and do it. It's not enough. Now, there are people, theoretically, for whom that would be enough. But in practice, you're going to struggle to find anyone for whom that is true. And that doesn't go away even when you're handing them specific passages, right? There's more that's needed. And that's where the breaking down from the Boolean cube to the recipe comes in. And my point in bringing all this up is that some of the concerns of why you wouldn't do this would be you don't have the time, you don't have the skill, you don't think it's going to make a difference. You're wrong on all three counts. And I think I've proven it to you already in this video. You don't need to be some expert. You don't need a doctorate in divinity to do this. You don't need to have been taken to the highest point and shown the entire world or any other crazy spiritual experience. You don't need any of that. All you need is to share what you know while thinking about the best way you can present it to another person. Now, the good news about that is the second you do it, you will instantly begin to be better at it. But it takes a lot of practice. And so it's not something you're ever done. So don't see limitations as a reason to not do it. You have to do it. It's actually part of the price that you need to pay for the things that you've already received. And that's something I'll talk a lot more about later, but not that you should do this out of duty. But if you care about those other people, you have to understand that there are a lot of people out there who are going to need it in a different package than you received it in, or they won't accept these things. And these ideas are very important, and they need to be shared with others. So I challenge you to try this. Maybe you can just jump in and grab a random section of a book or a video. You could do the same thing with a transcript of a video or as you're listening to one. Or maybe just pay attention as you're reading or listening, and if there's something that you find is particularly valuable, maybe that's where you start and try to restate these things to other people. And maybe it's in some formal thing that you prepare, which obviously takes a little time. Or maybe it's informally and you just earmark it. You throw a bookmark in the book and you say, I'm going to gather my family around tomorrow night after dinner and we're going to talk about this. It doesn't have to take hours and hours of preparation. You do what you can. But that's still a big difference from not doing what you can, right? And you will see those fruits in the lives of the people that you try this with. So I encourage you to do this. And not just, I've shown you all of this working off of a book that I wrote. And as you know, I've made a lot of videos, there are blog posts, but this is a skill that applies to anything that God teaches you. You could be talking about an experience you had or something you read in the scriptures. It's all fair game. Your job is to find and share the things that you have found to have the greatest value. And so you can do that as actively or passively as you want, but the point is to do it. So hopefully this helps you with that.